So quickly, just introductions. Myself, I'm Tim Middlehurst. I work for Certified Energy. We are a provider of energy certification services in New Zealand. Our purpose effectively is to support production of renewable energy and to facilitate the maximum value for producers of renewable energy. We've operated the NZECS for a number of years now, the electricity certification system, and we're very excited to be able to play a role in supporting the growth in renewable gas in New Zealand. Ian, do you want to say a few words?
Sure, Tim. So I'm Ian Dempster. I'm helping Tim with this process. Some of you will know me from my time at GIC. Prior to that, I had various involvements in the energy sector. If you go back to when people were riding dinosaurs, I used to do long-term power system planning. Spent a bit of time in investment banking where I did mergers and acquisitions and a bit of strategic advice on energy acquisitions and planning. So I've been around a while and I've got the grey hairs to prove it.
Really quickly running through the process of consultation, then we have published a discussion paper. The discussion paper contains a number of concepts that we see as important to implement into the certification system. Fundamentally, the gas certification system that we're proposing is intended to bring a whole range of international certification concepts, both for gas and other energy carriers, and then ground that in the New Zealand gas industry in terms of our history, our current and our aspirations. And so the consultation process is really important for us to learn a bit more about what participants may wish to do within the constraints of energy certification, and so therefore make sure that we understand the priorities for the system and how best to support that activity. All input is welcome. Feel free to comment on the discussion paper or any of the topics, plus anything that's not contained within it. Really keen to seek feedback. We will be summarising and responding to the feedback we received through this initial process, and we'll be publishing a document summarising those responses prior to the release of the draft rules. Really quickly, we need feedback on the discussion paper before the start of day on the 23rd of May, which gives us a little bit of time still, and then we'll be aiming to have the draft rules out early July and the initial rules published early August. So a condensed consultation time frame, but a key point to stress here is that we don't see this initial publication as being final, but rather it's a starting point for us to develop a functional certification system in collaboration with the industry going forward. Ian, did you want to run us through the definition of renewable gas?
Yeah, sure. Okay, renewable gas. Well, we basically say what it is on that first line. Gas which has got wholly renewable production inputs. So obviously, biomass as a general situation is renewable. But I guess we're particularly interested in biomass that isn't competing with food sources and things like that. You don't want to get into sort of ethical issues. The other thing is those gases which don't cause the emission of carbon dioxide in their production are of particular interest as well. And hydrogen or green hydrogen is a classic example of that. And I guess that brings us to the two obvious renewable gases that are around at the moment. And that's biomethane that's been derived from biogas. And if you think about what biogas is, something that comes from an anaerobic digestion process, that in its raw state will be a mix of methane, water, carbon dioxide, and some other impurities that may be things like hydrogen sulfide and so on. In order to upgrade that to biomethane, you need to strip out the water and at least most of the CO2. You definitely want to get rid of things like sulfur, so hydrogen sulfide, you want to get rid of that. And you want to essentially process it so that it meets the natural gas specification standard, and then it's able to be injected into pipelines. Hydrogen from renewable sources is obviously a really good option, and in fact you can blend hydrogen directly into the natural gas stream without obviously destroying that, the adherence to spec, which is good. Yeah, so those are the ones that are kind of around now or just coming over the horizon, but there are other technologies that are either being researched or being developed, and obviously as those come to market, we should obviously include those in the things that are able to be certified. Tim, back to you.
Thank you, Ian. So I just wanted to talk quite briefly around a number of the design elements of the system. These are things that we see as important in order to provide the function of attribute certification and transfer. So I'll run through a couple of points here really quickly, and then if you have any questions around these, of course, please ask or let us know if you want to pause. From the top, the concept of book and claim effectively is an aspect of certification that we see as very useful. It enables us to track a particular attribute and claim ownership to that via digital transfer. In that claiming process, it's really important that those claims are only made in one place. And so as a concept of certification, a claim must be unique and must be verifiable to as unique in itself. One of the reasons that we therefore require the reporting entity to be involved is so that all parties involved in that attribute transfer know what's going on effectively and have clarity around their own emissions characteristics, if that is the attribute of interest. We do all of this within a particular time period, and the initial time period proposed is a 12-month production year. The timing of that production year, as proposed in the discussion paper, is to align with the New Zealand gas year. And the concept of time period matching is, as opposed to an unended time period which allows stockpiling, requiring things to match within a particular time period enables balancing and reconciliation. So we can still hold together concepts of consumption volumes and production volumes, and within that time period we can apportion ownership of all of the attributes that took place within that production. So we'll talk about it a bit more, of course, but what's really important for us is that we can enable every energy user to understand what the attributes of their energy type was, both those who are engaging explicitly in the purchase of a certificate and those who are receiving the residual supply. Along the same lines of logic, it's sensible for us to have a clear boundary around the area which we enable attribute transfer to take place. So the electricity certification system currently uses the geographical boundary of New Zealand. We have the same need to define a boundary for the gas system. There is, of course, ability to transfer attributes between on-grid and off-grid, pipeline connected and non-pipeline connected production projects. And so we need to look at what the most logical boundary is for this gas certification system. The RSM we mentioned quite quickly, but there is in any qualifying contractual instrument design, it's important that we are accounting both explicitly for attributes and implicitly. So there are a number of examples where the residual supply mix will come into play, and effectively that will be the sum of all production types minus those production types that have had their attributes explicitly transferred. And that enables all energy users who are not actively participating in energy certification to understand also the attributes of their supply. This becomes more important as incoming gas types to the market differ from renewable, non-renewable, zero carbon, non-zero carbon, and also along any other attribute dimensions that do arise over time. The concept of bundled or unbundled certificate supply is an interesting one. Our proposal is that certificates are not required to be attached or bundled along with the underlying energy molecules, and that in fact the certificate can be sold anywhere within the same market boundary. This is logical and credible in our mind, provided that we are tracking all attributes implicitly and explicitly, and enables the producer of renewable gas to gain maximum benefit from that transaction, which ultimately we see as having the best chance of supporting more renewable production over time. System roles, pretty simply, we think it's important that parties are clearly characterised, registered, and understood within the roles of the constraints of the system. And so we have fundamentally the idea of a registrant, which is a producer, and the operator of a production device, and a participant, which is effectively someone engaged in the commercial activity around certificates, be it trading or sale of energy certificates. And they would ideally be the party responsible for a particular energy user. So the creation of these roles enables us to manage all interactions within the certification system with a high degree of oversight, while still making sure that the minimum number of parties are exposed to the higher levels of administration. That implies the use of a registry, which we have in place already in relation to the electricity certification system, and are committed to providing for gas certification as well. Fundamentally, the registry is the place where all the activity will formally take place. So the creation and maintenance of the accounts, the registered and participant accounts, the registration of the production devices, and the place where all information around that production is held. And therefore also that provides the basis for the issuance of certificates, transfer and redemption of those certificates against participating energy users. We see as a really key part of this the need to go through a process of verification of participating production devices. So any facility that wishes to be able to issue renewable gas certificates will need to have their site, their processes, their inputs reviewed in order for us to be able to verify that the information contained within their energy certificates is true and correct. I won't dwell too much on the transaction effectively, but it's key for us to enable issuance and transfer from one party to another, of course. We do that through a couple of key steps. One is the creation of a certificate, the issuance, and the other is the redemption against the energy user. It's important for us to recognise that there is a title being transferred from a seller to a buyer, and that once redeemed, that step effectively allocates that emissions unit to a particular energy user, and that's where it stays. Ian, did you want to talk about the next couple?
Yeah, sure. So units of measurement, obviously the certificates need to have a standard unit. And if you think about the gas industry, you'll find that bills for gas tend to be denominated in either kilowatt hours or gigajoules, and kilowatt hours is usually what you'll find on domestic bills, small commercial, and that sort of thing. The larger users tend to have their bills in gigajoules. If for no other reason, then there'd be an awful lot of zeros if they were in kilowatt hours. But the thing is all of those units are completely interchangeable. I mean, a kilowatt hour, a megawatt hour, whatever, is just simply a measure of energy, and the joule is the SI unit for energy. So they are completely interchangeable. So it's more a matter of convenience than anything else. What's in the discussion paper as a proposal is that we use units of megawatt hours, which would make the gas certificates the same denomination effectively as the electricity equivalents. And a megawatt hour is, if you convert that, it's 3.6 gigajoules. But the question, I guess, is whether people who are gas users would find that confusing and would, prefer not to have to convert back and forth. So we're obviously interested in feedback on that. The next one, measurement of gas consumption. Obviously, holders of certificates will redeem those against their consumption, which obviously means you have to be able to measure their consumption accurately, in a timely fashion, and so on. And in particular, Tim mentioned earlier on about the processing of certificates needing to be time bound. Obviously, you can't go too long beyond the end of the gas year before you've got everything wrapped up. But the takeaway there is that obviously meters, particularly for large users, are measured either daily or at least monthly. And so the data is actually readily available and fits into the processing cycle that we will be proposing. So from that point of view, you don't have to worry about the fact that you've got a long tail with the downstream reconciliation rules and all of that sort of thing, because you do have the data that you need for individual gas users. Back to you, Tim.
Very good. And a couple of points really quickly around the attributes. It's a bit of a jargony term we use, but effectively any particular characteristic of the production can be classified as an attribute. So we talk about renewable, non-renewable, is something that we talk about a lot, of course. Any associated emissions, particular units around those emissions that were caused during the production process is another attribute. Really, any other dimension upon which a production device can be differentiated from others is a potential attribute. There's a bit of a trade-off between marketplace liquidity and attribute differentiation, but what we are fundamentally attempting to do here is enable production devices to seek sort of just reward for things they are doing that are better than others in the marketplace. And so there is the potential for other environmental co-benefits, social co-benefits, a range of other things. We've seen internationally that some of the attributes and labels that take hold within certificates might be whether a production facility has received any governmental funding or anything like that. All those things may have relevance to a buyer and so are possibly able to be included within a certificate. We foresee that this might develop over time and that there may be innovation on the production side over time as well, and that some parties may wish to see that innovation represented within the certificates. The final point is that we do see that the certificate is the place where all attributes are transferred. There is a risk of confusion once we start separating energy and certificates, and if you enable attributes to be transferred in multiple different streams, we see that the risk of that confusion becomes unacceptable.
Okay, so how are we going to apply this to the New Zealand gas industry? I should say that this slide is really mostly about gas that's being sold via the shared networks. So I'll just add some other stuff about sort of off pipeline gas at the end. But the key thing is the gas that goes into the shared networks, by definition, has to be spec gas. It has to be to NZS 5442 standard. And that's a requirement of the interconnection agreement that you have with the pipeline owner. So it's not something that these rules will look to govern. It already exists. Similarly, the interconnection process, at least on the Maui pipeline, is a flow to nominations process, which means whoever is injecting the gas, whoever is selling the gas that is being injected, their purchasers will be nominating gas from that receipt point into the pipeline. And those shippers are deemed to get those nominations. So it's up to the producer to make sure that as much as possible, their production matches the nominated quantities that have been requested by their customers. The other thing that you need to know for interconnection is the characteristics of the gas entering the system, particularly the calorific value, because what we've got to keep straight here is it's not volumes of gas that we're tracking, but volumes of energy. And the issue there is that gas measurement systems measure volume, not energy. You have to convert using a whole bunch of mystic incantations, one of which is the calorific value. So you need to obviously take that into account. Timely delivery, that again goes back to being able to reconcile usage of certificates against production and consumption. And the last point, fungible commodity. Essentially what we're talking about there is that a shared system, you can't actually track those molecules, all right? So it's not possible for me sitting in Wellington to insist that, you know, the molecules injected somewhere in South Taranaki actually get to my gas meter. That's just a nonsense. But the fact is, a gigajoule of green gas is fundamentally the same as a gigajoule of natural gas. So if I have purchased, you know, X number of gigajoules of green gas, then either I'm using them or somebody else is. But the point is, the green gas that I have caused to come into the system is being consumed. And so it's fair enough for me to, in my carbon accounting, you apply the certificate that I have got in respect of that green gas and say my usage is green. And it basically goes back to Tim's book and claim point on one of the earlier slides, that, you know, the benefit goes to whoever books and claims that renewable gas. Little thought experiment. Here's an example of essentially pipeline connected production and pipeline connected consumption. So you've got a scenario where a polytechnic wants to reduce its carbon footprint. It doesn't want to go the electrification route, as, of course, being an educational establishment, it's got no money. It can't produce enough biogas from its own waste, and would be keen to obtain biomethane from a third party. And there's a council-owned wastewater treatment plant which is currently capturing methane and flaring it, because obviously that's far preferable to letting the methane just go to atmosphere. But if it could sell certificates in order to help its cash flow, that would allow it to, you know, clean the gas up and inject it into the pipeline, and thereby displace some natural gas. So it looks like there, the Polytechnic and the council could potentially get together and cut a deal. And the question we're asking there is this okay? And it certainly looks to us like it's a perfectly reasonable proposition. You're getting green gas into the pipeline because somebody wants that for their own carbon accounting purposes. You're obviously having less fossil gas being combusted. So, all around that looks like a good thing. And if certification enables that to happen, then presumably that's a good thing as well. And there's another example here where we've got pipeline connected production, but consumption that's not pipeline connected. So here we've got an abattoir wanting to install a digester to process its organic waste. It'll use at least some of that gas on site for hot water, which abattoirs need quite a lot of. But it probably will produce more gas than it requires, and it figures it could inject that into a nearby pipeline. Except that the gas price alone doesn't make that viable. Then we have a poultry farm that would actually like to buy certificates to redeem against their LPG consumption. All right, so, and they're willing to pay enough for those certificates that would tip the balance for the abattoir being able to install the digestion unit and capture the gas. So the question is that okay? And I have to say, this is one that has been exercising our minds somewhat. And so have a think about that. I don't think we have got a definitive answer, but certainly interested in any comments that people might have on that. Alrighty. So one of the things we also need to think about in the design of a certification scheme is that there is potential opportunity for export of renewable energy via gas. All right. So the classic example of that would be, can you electrolyze water, produce hydrogen, compress it, ship it offshore somewhere? And without going into whether that is actually feasible, whether we have enough spare green electricity going to be able to do that, I think it's worth just thinking about what that means for the design of a certificate system. And what you obviously need is a high quality production certification. You need to absolutely assure that the hydrogen, say, is totally green. But you also need strong alignment between the New Zealand gas certification system and relevant international schemes, i.e. schemes where that hydrogen may be being received. So you need to align the methods and standards applied to certification, the sort of the format and content of the certificates. And you also need some ability to account for international transfers. So it doesn't immediately become obvious how you would do that, but obviously aligning the New Zealand scheme with what is going on overseas certainly paves the way to be able to support export if and when that ever happened. So the other thing we need to think about, Tim said earlier, you know, we're not going to get this absolutely right from day one, but also there may well be developments in the market that will also drive the need to change the rules. So the rules themselves need to contain an ongoing rule change ability. One of the things that is suggested in the consultation paper is the formation of a technical advisory committee, a group of industry and customer worthies who would be able to, I guess, help inject information into a process that would evaluate whether changes were needed and what sort of changes, because you don't want to change the rules and make them worse, obviously. We also see that consultation would be a part of the rule change process. It's always good to have extra eyes on things, and you know, consultation often flushes that out. And all of this obviously correlates with, you know, the assurance process that you need for a certification process.
We fully expect the system will develop over time. However, we do want to put in place some ability for participants to at least foreshadow the direction it might go. So these principles, again, we seek feedback on them, but we see these being key principles for the system now into the future. First of all, the system is designed to support renewable gas. Renewable gas, amongst other things, is intended to enable organisations to decarbonise their operations. So the system should be geared towards having impact on net carbon emissions. It needs to be really reliable, it needs to be really accurate, and it needs to have all the relevant information baked into it. So great conversation here already around what information is relevant. Again, that can be expanded. Our mission in the first instance will be to make sure that we don't miss anything critical. And then if there are more informational aspects that are required, you know, we can go through the relevant process to include them in the certificates. Principle 3, again, in relation to Ian's point, both for organisations who are operating here in New Zealand and those who wish to potentially participate in export of renewable gases, it's really important that we are relevant and related to international standards. That's part of our role. We are independent fundamentally to any specific party in the New Zealand gas industry, and that's important to us again. And finally, that the system remain flexible and fit for purpose. So our intention now is to initiate a system for renewable gas certification so that the market is aware that that function is available. And then we fully expect that applications of certification will develop and that there may need to be associated development of the systems, rules, standards, etc., to make sure the principles, the elements, and conduct in the system are fully to the required standard. Richard, we've got a question from you. You're the first person to ask a question. Would you like to jump on and ask your initial question?
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so just a question out of the gate there about the variability of different renewable gas feedstocks and their associated emissions profiles. Would we be planning to record those different emissions as part of the attributes, depending on feedstock?
I think the key thing there is where is the feedstock coming from? I mean, if this is, irrespective of what the feedstock is, if it's going to essentially be being, otherwise left to rot and emitting its carbon to atmosphere, then I don't think you need to worry too much about the makeup of it. If, on the other hand, you are looking at biomass that isn't just waste, then yes, you probably will need to look at accounting for that, because you start to get into all of the issues of, biomass that is being grown that would compete with food crops and all of that sort of stuff. But we've generally been looking at sort of waste type products, be that out of the forestry sector or out of the agricultural sector and so on. And of course, municipal waste.
And just to add, the assessment of the feedstocks will be part of the production device verification process, just to understand how it is that the production facility produces renewable gases. And so that information will be captured, whether it's deemed to be an additional attribute or not, provided it has value to users of a certificate, it can be included in some way in the informational package. Ian's point, there may emerge differentiation of value between different feedstocks, even within classifications of renewable. At that point in time, it may be worth establishing an attribute for differentiation upon those dimensions.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Ian.
Richard, you've got another question.
Oh yeah, the other one was in relation to how the system might interface with the ETS as that develops over time. Is there any thought into how the two systems would I guess cooperate?
That's a great question. I'm not sure we have a full and complete answer for you. In the first instance, it's worth just mentioning explicitly that this is a voluntary system. And so effectively, it would operate outside the realm of the ETS. It is a developer seeking a product to market and provide a value to that marketplace dependent upon what it can provide to the purchaser. The second part of your question was in relation to pricing. And so I'll touch on that really quickly as well. Effectively, the price of a renewable gas certificate we would expect will be determined by the counterparties in the trade. And so if one of the reasons that a purchaser is seeking to procure a renewable gas certificate is because they're trying to decarbonise, and one of the problems with their organisational emissions profile may be associated cost, then we would expect that the value of an NZU would be a relevant input into the price and value of a renewable gas certificate. But we also expect that there is a potential that other factors may come into play over and above that. The key point there is that it's a bilateral agreement, and so subject to a number of market forces.
Cool, thanks, Tim.
We have a question from Kostan. Do you mind introducing yourself really quickly and asking us that question, Kostan?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Kostan Banos. I work in the Green Power program in Australia. We're a national program run through the state governments, and we're sort of looking into renewable natural gas as a logical pathway, because currently we're just electricity. So my question is, will each participating generator require a life cycle analysis to determine the embedded emissions of that particular feedstock?
And in short, we have no decision made at this point in time to require that. Very keen to hear if that's something that people would like to see. However, the focus at this point in time is understanding the nature of the production process itself. There is a process we will need to undergo to look at classification of feedstocks and process of verification, and we may end up at this point, but we haven't specifically got that far as yet.
Yep, great. Thanks, Tim.
We have a question from Tim Street. Tim, do you want to quickly ask us your question?
Sure. I'm relatively new to the gas industry. This might be a question for Ian. Is it always safe to assume that 1 extra megawatt hour of biogas will always offset fossil gas, or could it actually offset some other form of biogas?
Thanks, Tim. Look, certainly at the moment that's the case. If we ever got to the stage where the existing gas fields were in massive decline, and there had been an awful lot of biogas production coming to market, then yeah, you might start to approach the situation where biogas facilities are competing with each other to actually get their product into the pipeline or to the end user. However, I think because of the nominations type system that runs with the pipeline, that will tend to take care of itself, because if people are procuring gas from biogas facilities, then those facilities will be nominating the gas into the pipeline. And that what that effectively means is the people who are buying biogas at the other end are receiving the energy equivalent of the biogas that has been injected. All right, so it's not about when I was talking before about biogas effectively displacing fossil gas. That is true in the current sense, but if you had a situation where the pipeline was entirely transporting biogas, then obviously that's no longer a true statement. So it's going to change over time, but you're always going to be in the position where, as long as the producer that you're buying from is injecting the volume of gas that you are purchasing, then the whole thing works.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Tim and Ian. Thanks for this. Ian, you were talking about interconnection requirements with transmission pipelines. What about distribution systems? If this is connected to a distribution network, what's your thoughts on how that would work?
Well, you'd have to have exactly the same requirement that a green gas producer only injects spec gas. I mean, that's a requirement under the gas safety and measurement regulations, and there is no exemption for that. So before you allowed somebody to directly inject into a distribution network, you would have to obviously arrange some certification of that. And actually, I guess the other thing you'd have to arrange is making sure that it was odorized.
Yes. All right. Thank you for that, Ian.
That's
But
right.
in essence, you're saying that this is something that distribution networks, your expectation would be distribution networks would kind of have the contracts and processes to facilitate those outcomes. Because I guess I don't think distribution networks do currently.
No, I don't think they're geared up for accepting gas generally. But I think that is a development that would have to occur, and it does seem to me that it's the distributors that are best placed to manage that. You wouldn't want something in the certification to be doing that, because it's an agreement between parties who neither of whom actually owns or controls the distribution network.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Ish, I wonder, just I see a question down the bottom there, Tim, from Len Howes about impurities. Do you want to take that while we're at it?
Feel free.
So, Len, do you want to, if Tim turns your microphone on, do you want to ask your question for the...
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, good as gold.
All right. No, it's a random question. I wasn't expecting it to necessarily be answered right now, but so you've given me the opportunity. The question really just was trying to recognise that gas is used in things other than combustion, and that often impurities that may not matter when you burn gas actually might be quite critical from a process point of view. So just trying to understand really what the quality assurances around the biogas that would ensure that material doesn't come in that's actually going to make processes unsafe.
Sure, and I think the key thing there is making sure that the gas meets spec in terms of its composition, those things are set out in the spec. So you would expect anybody using gas for chemical processes from a shared network would obviously be expecting spec gas, and so they should be able to handle it. I think your point is particularly appropriate where somebody is making a connection to a green gas producer directly rather than via a shared network, because that type of connection isn't actually required to be spec gas. As far as the gas safety and measurement regs are concerned, it just has to be safe. So I think that would be pretty much handled as between the buyer and seller. But to the extent that you might expect the buyer would want certification as to the greenness, then you probably would actually specify what the constituents of the gas were as part of the whole attribution process.
Can I just quickly ask the question then in relation to gas back at the injection point into a shared system? Because my understanding at the moment is that you're actually required to inject to meet the gas spec. You can't rely on the system to actually even it out. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Each injector should. Well, I was going to say should be. No, must inject spec gas. And if they discover that they're not, they either have to put it right straight away or stop injecting.
So I suppose my point is that a lot of the biogas type things are probably not going to meet the gas spec, are they? Particularly on things like Wobby index.
well, I guess that's why we say biogas as such probably won't and will need to be cleaned up, so that, you know, I mean, if you get to something that is mostly methane, I think you probably are going to meet the gas spec. But yeah, I mean, biogas in the raw sense, but by the time you look at, you know, the water content and the CO2 content and so on, it could be a country mile away from spec. So you wouldn't want to be doing that. I am aware in the UK there, if you actually, you'll find this on the Scotia Gas Network's website. They do have some digesters, or, well, actually, sorry, they don't own them. I think they get the gas from them. There are digesters around the country that take animal manure and process that into biogas. And then they use a propane that SGN calls propanization, which is obviously adding propane to the mix to bring up the CV to spec. And then they take that into their local distribution system. Now, that seemed to be a rather brief explanation to me when I read it on their website, because I thought there's probably more to it than just chucking in a bit of propane. I'm sure they must have to dry it up a bit and do more to it. But that is probably a property of, you know, the digestion process. One of the post-processing bits of equipment that's there would be my guess.
So can I just maybe finish this conversation a little bit? I'm just thinking about gas standard. You mentioned NZS 5042 there. Obviously, you're aware that First Gas are looking at hydrogen trials. I mean, you guys are looking at potential biomethane. Is there some sort of coordination likely between parties to redesign the gas spec for the future?
Ooh.
Yeah,
Probably desirable, but you know, that is always a thorny issue. I mean, from in the early days of Gas Industry Co, there was a review as to, you know, whether the gas spec should be altered. There were some end users that were quite keen to see the spec tightened up in terms of things like WABI and so on. And while I could understand, you know, the benefits to those end users, it would have put quite a lot of cost onto the producers, and wasn't, you know, necessarily a general good. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is there's a whole raft of consumer appliances out there that expect the current gas spec. Now, sure, they would work with a tighter gas spec, but depending on how you modified it, you might start to run into problems with some consumer appliances.
Yeah, but you mentioned that there's no problem injecting gas into the current gas system if it was hydrogen. But I'm pretty sure there's a hydrogen spec on the current gas system that would limit quite extensively the amount you can put in. So presumably, you know, in terms of planning to blend more hydrogen in the gas, it would need to be reviewed anyway, wouldn't it?
So I might just jump in real quick, Ian. So we are not directly involved in the delivery of any underlying gas products, which I think is just a relevant point around this conversation. So really what we see is a logical role for renewable gases in the decarbonisation of our collective industries, and the ability for a certificate product to increase the attractiveness of some of these production methods. So certification, you know, where gas production is happening, some of that gas production may or may not be injected into pipelines under a range of requirements. Then the ability for issuance and transfer of certificates can take place. The role of the certificate really is to enable a producer to communicate all those attributes / characteristics. And Len, I do note you've got a question on some of those attributes. which I might ask if we can come back to at the end of the slides. But really it's about communication of some of those attributes that aren't immediately recognisable through the molecular transfer. So aspects of ownership, age, etc. Some of those things are the things that certification really relate to. Do note that there'll be a range of questions around how New Zealand can actually transfer hydrogen, biomethane, other things, but that's not really in our remit right now.
So specification, not an attribute?
Not directly.
You talk about renewable gas, and I think you mentioned biomethane and green hydrogen as one. But I'm just wondering whether the concept wasn't actually wider than renewable gas. You're actually talking about zero emission gas, and whether that might not also include things like bio-LPG, hydrogen with carbon capture and usage and sequestration, or even the turquoise hydrogen, which is appearing at the moment, which effectively is not a renewable gas, but it doesn't actually have any CO2 emissions associated with it. Is this a renewable energy gas scheme, or is it a zero carbon gas scheme?
Let me have first crack, Ian. It's, in some ways you can consider it just as a gas certification system. You have a question around attributes. Really quickly, if we think about the key attributes, there are things like age, location, ownership, and then effectively its production method, any inputs to that production itself, as opposed to fundamentally the construction of the production process, but the operation of the production process, and therefore subsequently, you know, what responsible emissions would a consumer of that gas have? So really we start to be able to say, you know, you can verify anything, and what the certification process will do is make sure that those components are accurate and able to be transferred. And then the question comes, does that particular production type, is it able to be achieved here in New Zealand? Does it have a marketplace in New Zealand? And if so, you know, how is that value transfer enabled? Is there a direct connection perspective between a seller and a buyer? Or is there in fact a disconnection physically between someone who wants to buy that gas type and the seller of that gas type? And if so, can certification play a role in enabling that transfer?
Okay. The other question really was just around the market. How will the certificates be valued? Is it kind of going to be very closely linked to the ETS scheme, or are you seeing some other mechanism for setting price?
So really quickly, great question. The value of the certificate and subsequently the price of the certificate is going to be fully determined by the market. So there will be a bilateral agreement effectively. The producer of a gas product will have the ability to issue a certificate against their gas production. If they do so, they will have a view on what they will be able to get for that certificate in an open marketplace, and they will be able to go to a potential buyer and negotiate a price for it. There is a correlation we would expect between effectively the work that a purchaser of a certificate would be able to do with that certificate, and that, you know, fundamentally is correlated to decarbonising their own operations. So if you look at their ability to do that via the purchase of a gas certificate or via the subsequent purchase of a carbon credit, there is a correlation there between that work, and so therefore in terms of a conceptual price floor for a renewable gas certificate or a zero carbon gas certificate, you would expect that it's linked to the price of an NZU, for example. However, if a production facility has some form of social co-benefit, for example, perhaps it's creating jobs for the local community, something like that, and if there is a buyer in the marketplace who wishes to recognise and communicate their role in enabling that to take place, then we would see the potential for the seller of that certificate to get that recognised in the certificate price. And so really it becomes quite a flexible instrument for premium production methods to be valued appropriately.
So given that it's certificates capture the attributes of the gas, then presumably those attributes might change, and the mechanism for selling it on the market is more likely to be bilateral rather than traded as a commodity, isn't it?
Most likely, definitely in the short term.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose my last question really was, I mean, you're putting a lot of work into setting this up, but it kind of feels to me like it's quite early on in the piece. I'm not really seeing much happening in terms of actual need for these certificates at the moment? So what do you see? What do you see as a time frame for actually these gas certificates to be needed?
I would expect that as soon as there is renewable gas available, significant renewable gas available in the marketplace, there will be buyers for renewable gas certificates, and therefore buyers who will be willing to return additional proceeds to the producers of renewable gas.
No, I understand that, but when do you think that's likely to be?
I think a key thing will be when is biomethane able to be accepted into a pipeline. And I think that's a timeline that we'll follow quite closely.
Thanks.
Well, I think, Tim, it's probably worth thinking about other possibilities. I mean, we've got a wastewater treatment plant in Hamilton that makes quite extensive use of the methane that they produce. They've got an energy centre, so they do a bit of electricity generation and so on. They could well be interested in certifying their plant to help with their carbon accounting. I mean, here in Wellington, we've got the the Nova generating plant at the Southern Landfill. Again, they might want to, well, I suppose that's possibly more that they might want to certify their electricity as green, but I think there are off-pipeline possibilities that might actually want to use the certification system ahead of stuff being injected into the shared system.